as well as field research grants in the form of scholarships for researchers who are interested in form field research in Taiwan. So if you're not already subscribed to receive our updates directly in your inbox, you should do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. I'll be remiss if I began today's program without first thanking our co-founders, our directors, our advisors, as well as the staff and interns here who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. I am truly delighted to be able to host today's public seminar on information operations and democracy, the base of Taiwan. I want to thank our partner, the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, for helping support today's program. Now, around the world, authoritarian governments are leveraging information operations to influence the democratic process and degrade democratic institutions. As malign entities adapt to evolving social, technological, and political landscapes, the threat of influence operations to democracies is growing more complex. In many ways, Taiwan's position as a target of information operation campaign, IO for short, from the People's Republic of China has made it really the canary in the coal mine. For decades now, Taipei has been forced to grapple with these continuously evolving threats that have grown in scope and volume. One of the clear targets of PRC IOs has been Taiwan's elections to affect the political process by exploiting the fundamental nature of the openness in democratic systems. Taiwan's local and national elections in the past have been the targets of PRC IO campaigns. Taiwan just held its local elections, the 9-1 elections, on November 26th. In today's panel discussion, we will discuss the features of PRC IO campaigns targeted at the local elections. We'll also examine the effectiveness of Taiwan's efforts to combat PRC information operations. We also want to discuss and examine how the international community can learn Taiwan's strategy in countering aligned forces in the IO space. What are the trend lines in information operations, and how can build democracy adapt and respond to these evolving tactics, techniques, and procedures? And finally, where can Taiwan cooperate with the international community to address these challenges? I know this is a very tall order for our panelists, but certainly not for the excellent panelists that we have assembled here today, who are technical experts, renowned scholars that have really focused on these issues in their professional capacity. And so I will introduce them briefly in the order that they will be speaking. First, to my immediate left is Fan, who is the Deputy CEO and researcher at the Double Think Lab in Taiwan. Her research focuses on state-funded disinformation, how it influences people, and how to create a counter-narrative to combat it. She's also an activist concerning youth empowerment, human rights, and open government issues. Now, joining us virtually and our next speaker will be Nick Monaco, who is the Threat Intelligence Investigation Lead for Chinese disinformation at Microsoft's Digital Threat Analysis Center. He focuses on cross-strait disinformation, and his latest book, Bots, explores automated agents' influence on political, commercial, social, and cultural communications. And here with us, live in person, to my far left is Samantha Bradshaw, who is an assistant professor at American University School of International Service and an associated faculty member at the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology. Prior to joining AU, Sam was at Stanford University, working in the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, the Civil Society Lab, as well as a program for democracy and the internet. Last but not least, we have Dean Jackson, again, returning back to our virtual speakers. He is the project manager of the Influence Operations Researchers Guild at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Prior to that, Dean managed programs at the International Forum for Democratic Studies, which is a center for research and analysis within the National Endowment for Democracy. So without further ado, allow me to turn the floor over to Fly, who will kick things off for us on a current update on IO campaigns in Taiwan's recent local elections. The floor is yours.
Hi, Morgan. Thank you for inviting me. The local election in Taiwan just ended last Saturday. The results are very optimistic. Not only the candidate will be back, but also, let me just.
Feel free to, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's much better. So not only did the candidate win back, but there's a lot of pro-China candidates, like re-elected or elected. China's Taiwan Affairs Office stated that this result actually shows that Taiwanese people want peace, which is not true at all. Because based on our observation of this election, most of the discussions revolve around domestic issues rather than China's or China rich issues. So it's okay.
Oh, take this. Else is running away. Let's put it here. All right.
So the Deputy CEO of Double Lab, we are an organization in Taiwan that's focusing on state-funded disinformation and information operations. So we were founded in 2019. And to be honest, all of us were terrified and traumatized by the local election of 2018. So this year, we started a new project called Foreign Interference Monitoring Hub. So this project aims to build civil society capacity to defend against foreign interference for elections. So we start in July with a series of capacity building workshop and a 1-month internship program to train more than 20 students to join us in the election period. We also work with more than a dozen of NGOs in Taiwan, including Fact Check Initiative, grassroots organizations, and students groups to collect intelligence and data on these elections. We use OpenCTI and open source database structure to label and visualize our data. And there will be more report launched by Double Lab coming up this month. Next slide, please. Sorry, it was supposed to be this slide. Okay. Let me share some of the brief key findings we have for this election. First of all, there is less foreign interference compared than 2018. And second, we found there's a changing of methods in the information operation method is changing. Compared to the one-stop methods in 2018, where most of the narratives comes directly from China. Here, the select issues that have already been discussed in Taiwan and further amplify it. Finally, one of the long-term IO attacks that we found that were identified this year is a semiconductor-related IO, which attacked U.S. credibility in the last few weeks of the elections. Next slide, please. Okay. So why there is less foreign interference this year? It is crucial to know that that the 20th CPC National Congress meeting took place in early October. So most of the influence was actually delayed due to the uncertainty of the chain of command. Because of who will be in charge or what kind of narratives will be the main narrative is uncertain most of the election period. So we can see that information operation actually happens after the 20th National Congress. The second factor, which was widely recognized, is the pandemic. This is a local election this year in Taiwan. So rather than the significant scope of messages online, voters actually rely more on the word of mouth much more than the informations online. So in the past, especially in 2018 elections, there were a lot of agents from the United Front work. They were in Taiwan to interfering with the temple and also the village chief to spread the pro-China, pro-unifications narrative. But because of pandemic this year, there's a significant reduction of the numbers, the agents entering into Taiwan. Another factor is the budget. This is a hypothesis that because China's economy was actually declined because of the pandemic, so there might be a reduce of funding for information operation. The last part is also a hypothesis by us that we think they probably need to be a candidate that fits the IO narrative. There is no suitable candidate this year for the main body of the information operations in the local elections. And it's also very challenging for CCP to find a suitable candidate with a charisma and draw that much attention like Hangul did back in 2018. Next slide, please. Okay. So as I mentioned, there are fewer information operations this year, and we could observe that there is a change of method. Chinese media or Weibo writers pick up stories they already cover or discuss in Taiwan and amplify it with a twisted or urbanized narrative. So for example, like this one is actually in late October, there was a news of Taiwan National Palace Museum accidentally broke 3 pieces of treasure from China Qing Dynasty. It was reported in Taiwan because, of course, it is on the news. And China actually picked it up and twisted into like how Taiwanese government sold all the treasures that's come from China and use the money for their own good. And it's amplified by the Chinese state media as well. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another narrative that happens in Kaohsiung. This is a story in Kaohsiung that from October to September, there are 9 unknown deaths in the rivers. To be honest, it's not actually a surprise because usually in summertime, things like this happens. However, the story was also picked up by the Chinese media and Weibo writers to attack the government's integrity. Next slide, please. There are also narratives that was made in China but have not yet been widely spread to Taiwan during the election. Some topics have been trending on Weibo, and the Chinese official actually even hold press conference to discuss a response to this. But we did not see a discussion in Taiwan's local election and in Taiwan's social media environment. Both narratives revolve around cross-strait reunification and China's territory waters. There are narratives that were posted on some Facebook fan page they have admins from China. But because it was a local election, it doesn't really touch on Taiwan's current affair, so it doesn't really effectively disseminate. Next slide, please. Okay, and the last case that I want to talk about is the DSMC related IO. This is a really interesting case because you can see the mode of attack was actually from China and how they're trying to attack United States credibility and cause distrust of Taiwanese government. So this narrative went viral when the TSMC announced they will move the 3-nanometer advanced process to the United States. And the narrative is twisted to like DPP sold TSMC to United States to please US government. This caused an uproar in the last few weeks of the elections. A similar narrative actually could be traced way back to 2021. And we see this as economic united front work. They take advantage of TSMC's very important positions in Taiwanese economy and to spread distrust with the Taiwan and US government. Next slide, please. Okay. And we found a clear channel of how TSMC related IO work. As you can see, when TSMC announced the news, some Weibo writers, especially like those Weibo writers who are highly connected to China government, actually pick up those news and twist the narrative. And this narrative were later quoted by state media, including Xinhua, 观察者网, CCTV, Global Times, etc. And Taiwanese key opinion leaders will then pick up those news that were reported by the China state media and post on Facebook or YouTube. And Taiwanese media will then pick this up again in Taiwan. So this is how the channel that create this information operation environment make it to the traditional news media, not only just online social media kind of operations. Okay. Other than the open source intelligence that we found, prosecutors in Taiwan also found that China Microvision and Facebook fan page was suspected of accepting CCP capital to engage in IO in Taiwan during this local election. They are still under investigation, but because they already announced it to the news, so I think they already found the money flow and everything. Next slide, please. Okay, so to summarize, the local elections this local elections four kinds of narrative. First is the cultural unification, like the National Palace Museum case, and also Taiwanese language education. This kind of issue is used to promote big China ideology and unification. The second one is to attack government integrity and safety issues, like pandemic, and create distrust. And also there's ones to attack US credibility with semiconductor related IO as a long-term campaign, and we expect it to keep playing a role in the future election. That's among this. After the 20th CCP National Congress, CCP officials have stated multiple times during the election period of one China policy, but mostly you can see is for China's domestic stabilizations rather than actual interference with Taiwan. The next slide, please. This is the final slide. So to summarize everything, we observed in this election. It is getting more challenges to identify IO from CCP because when they pick up stories from Taiwan's media and twist the narrative, it's very difficult to say for sure this is a China information operation because they can quickly get away with saying like this is a freedom of speech and we're just agreeing each other's ideology. Even if we find suspicious actor and suspicious behavior between state media and Facebook fan page, it's still very difficult to identify them. Second is that we found that create distrust in long term. As we observe in this election and also during Russia-Ukraine war, that the CCP tend to recycle their narrative, and they could say they already predicted this years ago to make those narratives more credible. That's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mai. I mean, that was really you managed to cover a lot on the various information operations that you were able to observe in Taiwan in the lead up to this local elections. And I want to save this for you to answer this when during the moderated discussion. But a question that came to my mind as you sort of framed the talk in terms of both the results of the local elections in which the opposition party was able to won more seats than the DPP overall, but yet you observed that there were fewer information operations than in the past. So the question that naturally comes up is, how do you assess the effectiveness, of these campaigns in actually influencing people's behaviors, right, in terms of their votes? And if you have any insight, I know that's an issue that comes up quite frequently in this space, but think about it, and hopefully we can get into that in the discussion. Next, I want to turn it over to my good friend Nick, who will follow up with more background on China's tactics, techniques, and procedure with regards to its disinformation campaign in Taiwan, as well as any new trends that he is observing from his perch over there on the West Coast. All right, Nick, over to you.
Definitely. Thank you, Russell. And it's an honor and frankly just super exciting to be on a panel with everyone who are not only old colleagues, but people I consider old friends. So great to be here. Wish I could be there in person. I'll try to keep it brief today. I know we don't have much time. I'm Nick Monaco. I'm a disinformation researcher. I've been doing this for 7 years or so with a focus heavily on cross-strait disinformation. Specifically Chinese disinformation targeting Taiwan, but also Chinese disinformation all around the world. So today I'm going to try to talk a little bit about Taiwan, stuff I've seen in the past in the 2020 election and recently, and really give kind of more global context, I guess. What have we seen in the last few years that's changed in terms of Chinese I/O? I just dropped a couple links in the chat. These are pieces from a startup where I used to work until very recently, Maburo. The Maburo team was acquired by Microsoft in August, and we're now working at Microsoft. So that's the new name and fancy title and the whiteboard. But this is work that I think is really cutting edge that a lot of the team has done. Kind of looking at how Chinese influence operations have evolved in the last few years. So I'd encourage you to check them out if you're the kind of person who likes to read things. Yeah, so I know it's tough to pay attention to virtual talks. On top of that, I don't have any visual aids for you, so I hope you'll try to stick with me. I'll try to keep it brief and lively to do that. I'd say today the top line takeaway I have for you is that Chinese information operations have just grown much more aggressive. There's no getting around it in the last few years. And whether you're talking about volume, frequency, the number of people, or the number of targets that are being targeted with disinformation, or just the tactics that are being used, in every way, Chinese I/O is growing much more aggressive. And they're showing increased investment in this arena and using these tactics. And most recently, we saw this with China trying to interfere in the US midterms, which was a historic first. While we've known China has tried to interfere in Taiwan's elections several times in various ways, this is the first time we've actually caught China doing I/O targeting the US midterms, and that was based on announcements by Facebook in particular. And I also wanted to give kind of a quick outline of how I see, kind of the curve, this exponential curve, this crescendo of Chinese I/O increasing, if you will. I'll start with the Taiwan 2018 midterms, which were kind of a wake-up call, I think, for everyone in the Chinese disinfo research community. Then the Hong Kong protests, pro-democracy protests, really ramped up online I/O, information operations. The COVID-19 crisis beginning in 2020 really saw China invest a lot into spreading disinfo and propaganda that the US military created COVID, or whatever narrative alleged that COVID-19 did not emanate from China. Then in 2021, the Xinjiang cotton boycott, along with a lot of revelations about well-documented human rights abuses in Xinjiang, all of these 4 steps have really, each of them has been, something that has increased the Chinese government's willingness to engage in online information operations and disinformation. With that, I'll kind of get into the meat of the talk today very quickly. If there are 4 words I want you to remember from today, they're influencing, localization, privatization, and scale. And I'll talk about all of those very quickly. The 2020 election presidential report we did on the Taiwanese presidential election, which was 2 years now, so I'll be brief talking about it. But this was a report where we kind of looked at the presidential election when Tsai Ing-wen was running against Han Kuo-yu, and looked at what we saw. And kind of the main findings from that report were content farms, so websites that are kind of mirror images of each other that publish at a high volume, publish a lot of disinformation. We're really trying to support the KMT candidate, Han Kuo-yu, who ended up losing the election. But they were really playing a big role in Taiwan at that time. And I would agree with Fee's presentation just now that content farms are, if only, we don't know if it's temporarily or permanently, but really not playing quite the same role as they were in 2020. So that's a change in the landscape. The other thing I'd like to say about 2020 that we saw that unfortunately is still going on is there was a lot of disinformation targeting the Central Election Commission and the voting process itself in Taiwan. And that was something that also occurred quite frequently within the context of the recent midterms this past Saturday. There were a lot of pieces of disinformation floating around about, what the Central Election Commission does, how you vote properly, how you can't vote properly, stuff like that. Fortunately, the Central Election Commission was very engaged and would issue debunking memes and debunking content, kind of letting citizens know, actually, this isn't true. But this is something that's ongoing and I think a pretty vital threat to democracy, honestly. And with that, I'll get into the 4 words I want you to remember: influencing, localization, privatization, and scale. The first one, influencing. We're seeing a shift in the past few years from astroturfing, so using bots and fake accounts, to influencing with real humans with regard to Chinese IO. And I think the first link that I dropped in the chat here leads to one of our pieces about that. I cannot take credit for this work. I helped on it, but Lily Turner and Narit Hinkins, 2 of our great analysts here at the Microsoft team, really led on this research. That's really incredible. And basically, these influencers, the way that they operate, they have covert ties to Chinese state media outlets or the Chinese government and promote Chinese government viewpoints and propaganda, you name it, about the origins of COVID-19 or denying human rights abuses in Xinjiang. But critically, they don't disclose their affiliations, and they're very human. They get a lot of engagement organically. Bots are still being used, but they're bots and they're pretty bad. I've often called them dumb bots in the term, in the sense that they are pretty clearly bots and they're not getting a lot of engagement. So that's one big shift we've seen in the last 3 years or so. Kind of along with that, we've seen this trend of localization. And what I mean by that is putting the CCP's message or Chinese government's message into local languages around the world. So these influencers I've told you about, there's over 230 of them. They operate in 39 languages. There's over 85 million people that follow them on various social media platforms. And they operate in 70 plus countries. So they target, let's say, Egypt with Arabic language, or whatever it may be. Critically, these are Chinese citizens who are affiliated with Chinese state media, but are really, really fluent in a local language and very familiar with the context. So a lot of the content that they publish is kind of lifestyle oriented, but they're able to spread kind of CCP messaging in a language, in an environment where normally it wouldn't get through. And also historically, I have to say the CCP has been terrible at this, at translating their information operations into anything that's not Chinese. But they're really showing improvement in this in the past few years. And with that, recently we saw the first case of disinformation that was CCP aligned, that was actually in the Taiwanese language. So Taiwanese is a Chinese language that is not mutually intelligible with Mandarin. And there was a video that was circulating online calling on Taiwan to surrender to the Chinese government around Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island a few months ago. So that's just kind of something I wanted to flag, that an interesting case of localization with in the context of Taiwan. Privatization is the next thing I wanted to talk about, and I'll be quick. A lot of this disinfo is being kind of contracted out or done by PR firms or Black PR firms that are increasingly taking the lead on this. So there's been a lot of great work done publicly about places like OneSite, Arun Big Data, or people like Peng Guanjin, a guy in Taiwan who kind of is very overt about his willingness to work on any campaign, political or not, that will pay him to spread their message with bots and cyborgs and stuff like that. So this isn't new globally, but it is new within the context of the Chinese disinformation apparatus, and it's something we certainly expect to grow. And Fee touched on this, but there's also private sector focused IO. So things like promoting Huawei, attacking US mining companies, and the TSMC case that Fee just brought up. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is just scale. This might not, this is perhaps an obvious point, but it bears repeating. China operates at a scale with disinformation that really no one else on earth can compete with, no other nation state. So this is, whether it's in terms of money, humans, bots, you name it. Actors like Spamouflage and Dragon Bridge, these kind of CCP-aligned information operations actors, have tens of thousands of accounts to spread, verbatim quotes from Chinese state media or Chinese government statements on dozens of social media platforms all around the world. And this is not stopping, it's actually growing in scale. So that's kind of the last point I wanted to leave you with. So influencing, localization, privatization, and scale. These are kind of the evolutions we've seen over the past few years with Chinese IO. I'll end on a note that, I'm not known for being someone who expresses optimism very often, but Taiwan is a place that always really reinvigorates me, and I'm very inspired to see, again, the close collaboration between the government, the private sector, and the NGO space. I think nowhere on earth is better prepared to respond to these threats than Taiwan. And with that, I will cede the floor. Thank you.
Nick, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. I think you really provided a very helpful referencing, tool for us in the sort of four variables of influencing, localizing, and privatization and scale. Something that really struck me in your presentation, and I hope maybe we can get into this in the discussion, is your observation how the PRC is overcoming some of their challenges in IO campaigns. And I'm really interested in your observation and how they're overcoming this translation aspect of it, which is a very has been a very shortcoming of their ability to effectively prosecute IO campaigns outside of sort of the Chinese Chinese sinosphere, right? And I wonder whether or not several questions come to mind is how are they doing that, right? How are they doing that? And then and you've outlined how they're hiring locals to do so, but whether or not whether there are other methods that you might observe and can share, that would be interesting. And whether or not there are other sort of similar challenges, that they're learning from and adapting, and that could help better inform, our ability to respond to that. And another one is just, have we gotten any better at attribution? Being able to properly attribute, who actually are engaged in these IO campaigns. I know Phi, sort of acknowledged the difficulty in that, but what are you seeing from your vantage point, right? So just a couple of questions for you, to mull over as we sort of pursue in our discussion here, the rest of the presentation. So now I want to turn it over to Sam, sort of broaden our discussion a bit, to discuss some of the drivers of disinformation, how we counter that, and just broader trend lines overall. Sam, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Russell, for that introduction, and to Phi and to Nick for helping set the scene. So, I think we started with a very local look to Taiwan. Nick has kind of taken us a step back, talking about Chinese information operations more broadly. I'm going to take us a step back even further and kind of look at where IO trends are going over the next 5 years. So this will be kind of like a nice evolutionary story from the very local to some of the big global dynamics that we're seeing around information operations. You can go to the next slide, just the slideshow is no worries. Awesome. Okay, so the first point, and the first thing that I think we're really seeing changing around information operations is that they're full spectrum now. And what I mean by that is that they make use of the entire media ecosystem, both digital and traditional media, and also overt and covert. So, I was talking about how Chinese state-backed media and Weibo writers picked up stories about the museum items being broken. So you're seeing these kinds of narratives cross not only through social channels, but also through some of these more overt state-backed media channels. And so this really makes it an interesting challenge for people who are trying to combat influence operations because they're coming from a variety of media through overt and covert channels. We're also seeing these information operations move to alternative platforms. So it's not just Facebook or Twitter or Weibo, but it's also Telegram, it's Line, it's Parler, it's the Chans. We're seeing different alternative, more fringe platforms being infiltrated by state-backed actors to spread mis and disinformation. I've cited a little example here about Russian propaganda in Ukraine and how a lot of the information operations taking place there are shifting to Telegram because they got removed from platforms. And I think this shift represents a really, again, interesting challenge for researchers because it's one, much harder to access data through these channels sometimes, and two, there isn't the same kind of moderation standards that you see on mainstream platforms, and not only a lack of standards, but also maybe a lack of capacity. These smaller companies, even if they mean well, they don't have the same kind of resources to put together an entire trust and safety team to track and monitor these. Next slide, please. The second thing that I think is really new and interesting about the information operations that we're seeing today and where I think they're going to go in the future has to do with the role of identity in mis and disinformation campaigns. So it's not only about trying to spread a lie or trying to convince someone that something is not real when it is. Information operations often leverage what racial identity propaganda